Hey guys! Tonight we step into a frost-bitten yard before the sun has climbed. The air sharp enough to sting your nose and make each breath rise in pale ribbons. The ground is hard with frost, and your breath rises in faint ribbons as you cross the yard. You've been awake for a while already, though the sun is only now smudging a pale orange along the horizon. The hemp fields stretch out ahead, the stalks brittle and bowed under the weight of dew that will soak your cuffs before you even begin. A crow wheels overhead, letting out a half-hearted call, as if even it isn't quite ready to begin the day. You crouch to inspect the plants, fingers numbed by the cold, brushing against the sticky flowers clustered at the top. The resin clings to your skin, faintly sweet and earthy. You tug at the coarse leaves and testing their dryness. Somewhere behind you, a wooden bucket is set down with a thud. The sound carries across the still morning air. In the distance, smoke from a cooking fire threads upward, and the smell of damp ash mixes with the sharper scent of hemp. This is work that has been done in your village for generations. The plants will be stripped, dried up by tapourbous, and used for everything from rope to remedies to on occasion merriment. Historians still argue whether medieval folk fully understood the plant's intoxicating properties or simply stumbled into them in the course of making rope and oil. You've heard older neighbors speak of warming the mind or loosening the tongue after an evening near the right sort of smoke. Whether that's medicinal, unspiritual, or just good fun is anyone's guess. You probably wouldn't survive this life. The mornings alone, cold enough to make your teeth ache, would see you traded off for a sturdier worker in less than a week. Still, here you are, boots squelching faintly as you shuffle between rows, picking off the best of the buds. The repetitive motion and muffled sounds work into a rhythm, the kind that makes the minutes blur until the sun is higher and the frost has melted away. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And post your location and local time in the comments. It's always interesting to see who's listening from where. The stalks sway slightly, though there's no breeze. A hair darts from between them, startling you into straightening. Its fur is patchy, the white of winter still hanging on in places, and it bounds away toward the hedgerow. You shake your head and go back to work, muttering that even the wildlife here seems unsure what season it is. A fact you've heard from the traveling reeve in some towns. Hemp is a legal crop, cultivated under careful count to ensure enough for ship rigging and sailcloth. Though, it's both tool and indulgence. The chilling historian. Bedtime history tales might note that in certain records, cannabis was also prescribed in tiny doses for toothache, earache, or even melancholy, though good luck getting the dosage right without making the patient far more cheerful than intended. A bee lumbers past, far too early in the year for it to be sensible. You watch it weave unsteadily and disappear toward the thatch roofs at the village edge. Your neighbor, old Wymond, ambles by with a sack slung over his shoulder, pretending not to notice how much heavier it looks than just the morning's pickings. You nod politely, pretending not to notice either. Near the end of the row, you pause to straighten your back and glance toward the distant hills. The light has shifted. The fields are a dull gold now, the frost gone, replaced by the smell of wet soil and the sharper tang of crushed stalks underfoot. You gather the last of the morning's harvest into your sack. It is heavier than you expect, and you hoist it onto your shoulder, feeling the resin tug faintly against the wool of your tunic. In the far field, someone calls out a short, sharp sound followed by laughter, likely a dropped bundle or a misstep into a water channel. You smile faintly and turn toward the path home, the sack bouncing against your back with each step. Now, to the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The loft smells of dust and old straw, the air warmer than outside but close enough to make you wish for a window. You duck beneath a beam that has a nail sticking out of it, placed perfectly at forehead height, perhaps by some carpenter with a grudge, and make your way toward the rows of hanging hemp bundles. They sway gently in the dim light, each tied with rough twine at the stalk, the buds hanging downward so the resin can settle and dry. A single shaft of sunlight slips through a gap in the roof, falling onto a bundle nearest the ladder. The light makes the fine hairs along the buds glow like frost on spider silk. You reach out, fingers brushing over the brittle leaves. The texture is dry, almost papery, but the smell is still there, sharp, green, with a hint of something warm beneath it, like crushed fennel. In truth, drying these plants is more than just waiting. You've learned the loft's air must move just enough to keep mold from creeping in, but not so much that the leaves turn to dust too soon. Historians still argue whether medieval drying techniques were deliberate acts of preservation or simply an accident of necessity. Either way, the loft is doing its work. From below, the low hum of conversation drifts up. Likely your cousin and the neighbor's boy, and exchanging wild rumors about a traveling tinker who, according to them, sells pots that never boil over. You allow yourself a smile, mostly because if such a thing existed, every cook in the village would have one already, and the tinker would be living in a stone hall somewhere far from here. You step over a scattering of chaff, the floorboards creaking under your boots, and adjust one bundle's twine. The knot is loose, and if it slips, the whole stalk might tumble into the hay below. Not a disaster, but the hay is destined for the goat shed, and goats will eat almost anything you drop in front of them. That includes hemp, something you learned the hard way one winter, when two of them spent the evening looking dazed and deeply content. The bundles closest to the wall are older, their leaves curling inward, color deepening toward brown. Some will be stripped for fibers, some kept whole for brewing or other uses that the reeve pretends not to know about. A quirk of the trade hemp dried in a loft over a kitchen fire seems to carry a richer scent, perhaps from the mingling of smoke and fat rising from stews below. Whether that's better or simply different is a matter of opinion, and one you've heard argued at length over tankards in the alehouse. You pull a stool from the corner and sit, letting the silence settle. The occasional creak of the timbers feels almost like a heartbeat, steady and unhurried. The drying stalks above you sway slightly as a breeze threads in through the gaps in the wall. A tiny feather flutters down from some hidden sparrow's nest, landing in your lap. You tuck it into your pouch without much thought. You've learned small objects have a way of becoming useful later. From the far corner, the cat emerges, tail flicking in that calculated way cats have when they're deciding whether to acknowledge your existence. This one belongs to no one and everyone, slipping from loft to loft and house to house in search of warmth. It curls against your leg, pretending it's only here to watch for mice, though you suspect it enjoys the smell of the hemp as much as the rest of the village does. Below, someone shouts your name, the sound muffled through the boards. You ignore it for a moment, just long enough to feel the quiet press in again. Then you rise, brushing dust from your sleeves, and untie one of the older bundles. The stalk crackles faintly in your hand as you lift it, shaking off bits of leaf that drift to the floor. You take the ladder slowly, bundle balanced on your shoulder, the hemp scent growing stronger as you descend toward the grinder's shed. Outside, the light has shifted again later now, with shadows stretching long across the yard. The air smells of earth and something faintly sweet from the baker's oven down the lane. You pause to watch a line of geese march past the fence, each one stepping as though it has somewhere important to be. The grinder will be waiting, and the next step, messy, resinous, and oddly satisfying, is about to begin. The grinder's shed is dim and smells of oil, dust, and something sharper green and resinous that clings to the air. You push the door open with your shoulder, the hinges groaning like an old man getting up from a bench, and step inside. A small window near the roof lets in a stripe of light that falls directly across the work table. On that table sits the grinder itself, a heavy stone wheel fixed to a wooden frame. Its surface pitted from years of wear. A long handle juts out at one side, meant for two hands in a steady rhythm. Beside it, a heap of dried hemp flowers waits, their curled leaves shivering slightly in the draft from the door. You drop your bundle onto the table, the buds scattering small crumbs of leaf across the wood. You pull up the stool, reach for the pestle, and begin crushing a handful of flowers in the shallow clay bowl. The sound is soft but gritty, like footsteps on frost. Resin begins to cling to your fingers almost immediately, darkening your fingertips and making them tacky. The scent rises warm and earthy, filling the small shed until it feels like you're working inside the memory of summer. Historians still argue whether medieval folk ground hemp flowers purely for fiber preparation, or if some villages, because, like yours, deliberately set aside the choicest parts for more personal uses. You've heard the local herbalist claim the powder eases aches and untangles the thoughts, though it's equally possible she just likes the way it makes her customers linger in her shop. A creak at the door draws your attention. It's your cousin again, leaning in with the expression of someone pretending to be casual while clearly angling for an invitation. You wave him away, muttering that the grinder works better without his help. He smirks, probably because the last time he helped, he spilled half a bowl's worth onto the floor, and the cat, yes, that same roving creature rolled in it for the rest of the afternoon. You shift to the stone wheel, placing a handful of flowers onto its surface and pushing the handle forward. The wheel turns with a low hum, and the buds crumble under its weight. Bits of leaf fall into the collection trough below, where they'll be sifted later. The resin sticks in faint streaks to the wheel, making it gleam in the stripe of sunlight. By the time you've worked through the first bundle, your hands are coated in sticky residue. You rub your thumb and forefinger together, watching the strands pull and stretch before snapping. A little trick you've learned pressing that resin between small scraps of cloth traps the stickiness and leaves the scent behind. It's not perfect, but it saves you from walking around all day with fingers that could glue your tunic shut. On the far shelf, a small jar sits half full of last season's finest powder. It's darker than the fresh grind, richer in smell, almost musky. You lift the lid and take a slow breath. Some say older powder loses strength, others swear it grows in potency. Either way, the difference is enough that people in the village will pay extra for it quietly, of course, and usually in something other than coin. The door rattles as a gust of wind pushes against it, bringing in a swirl of dry leaves from the yard. You brush them away with the side of your hand, feeling the cool air thread through the shed for just a moment before the door swings shut again. It's a reminder that the season is shifting, and soon the last of this year's hemp will be harvested, leaving you with only what's been dried, stored, and ground. You stack the finished bowls carefully, each covered with a scrap of linen to keep out dust. The linen smells faintly of rosemary, likely borrowed from the herbalist's drying racks, and the scent mingles with the hemp in a way that makes the whole shed feel oddly inviting. You suspect that's part of the reason people like to help here. A final pass of the grinder leaves the wheel clean enough for the next round. You wipe your hands on a scrap of wool, the fibers catching some of the resin but never all of it. It will be with you until the next washing may be longer. You lift the first bowl of powder and step out into the yard. The sun has swung higher now, warming the side of the shed, and the distant sound of the alewife's ladle against her cauldron carries across the lane. The next stage of the process, steeping this powder into something drinkable, is calling. The sound of the ladle carries again wood on iron. A hollow bell, so you follow it across the lane. Bowl of greenish powder warm against your palms. Steam lifts from the alewife's open door in soft sheets, curling into the eaves and leaving the lintel damp. Inside, the heat wraps you like a thick cloak. You blink as your cheeks prickle, and the scent of wet grain, honey, and herbs folds over the sharper note you've brought from the grinder's shed. The alewife does not look up at first. She moves with the calm of someone who has stirred many mornings into evenings, sleeves rolled, hair pinned, eyes half-lidded in that practical focus that ignores everything but the simmering surface. The cauldron mutters. The fire snaps. She taps the rim with the ladle twice more, a habit rather than a need, and only then notices you lift the bowl in a small salute. She nods, the corner of her mouth bending as if to say, yes, and about time. Your joke comes easy and quiet. You tell her the grinder runs on courtesy, which is why it takes so long. She snorts once, which in this room counts as a laugh. You set the bowl by a jar of honey thick as amber. The rest of the table is a map of the brew-mashed barley slumped in a wooden trough, a cloth bag bulging with something bitter, dried herbs in little piles like Hill's yarrow, heather, a sprig of rosemary filched from the herbalist's rack. The alewife brews a brewed ale, the kind used before hops arrive here in force. That is the steady fact of this place in century many towns still flavor their ale with herb mixtures rather than hops, and house taste is as stubborn as a family name. She slides a hand under the honey jar and warms it by the steam. For the reeve, she says, a calmer cup. The reeve, who audits sacks and sighs at margins, is a decent man built like a gatepost and just as tense. You picture his shoulders dropping a finger's width with the first draft and another finger's width with the second. You add, under your breath, that by the third he will stop counting geese. The alewife hears you and pretends she didn't, which in here also counts as a laugh. You lean over the cauldron and watch the surface tremble. The mash has already had its rest. The color is a gentle brown, the foam faint. She lifts the cloth bag of herbs and lets it drip, then gestures to your bowl. You pinch a sample and rub it between your thumb and forefinger. It darkens, it releases that green scent, and grains of resin shine on your skin like tiny beads. The addition today will be small, measured, and stirred into a portion rather than the whole. Historians still argue whether such herbal steepings were common or rare, whether a few households knew and guarded the trick, or if many slipped such plants into private pots and never wrote a word. To be safe and quiet, she ladles a separate panful from the cauldron and sets it on the side stones, where the heat is steady but shy of a boil. You tip in a pinch, then another, because she tilts her head, and you have learned her signals the way sailors learn the wind. The powder softens in the foam and drifts below the surface like a slow comet. She stirs. The sound of the spoon on the pan is faint and friendly. She tells you the usual charms are done: the first stir clockwise to invite good yeast, the second counter to keep mice from investigations, the third just because her mother did it that way. As a peculiar tidbit of the trade, she lifts a small lidded jar labeled in chalk as Goddess Good, the house barm, scooped from the last batch to seed the next. It is a living thing, a thick, smiling substance that smells faintly of apples and warm bread. You know it is not holy, and yet you keep your breath shallow when she opens it, in case respect is contagious. Steam beads along the rafters and drips in a steady rhythm near the door. You step aside. Through that door, the village moves in slants of light, a boy with a hoop, your cousin again, strolling as if the day grew for him alone, the cat, who pauses, looks offended by the warm, damp air, and vanishes. On the far road, the geese return in their file, as if to prove you wrong about the reeve's counting. The alewife measures honey with the same care she uses when portioning taxes in her head. The honey loosens near the fire and flows in a slow ribbon into the pan. A lift in the rhythm, the scent sweetens. The resin's green edge softens to something round. You ask a question you have asked before because the answer changes. How strong, she says. Strong enough to make the reeve soften into his chair, not enough to make him sing. You agree that no one requires that. The last time he tried a song, he chose a psalm and then forgot the words halfway through, which caused the priest to stare so hard the candles struggled. She plates out a small ladle into a cup for tasting. This is not a festival. You and she sip like officials, not revelers, Basti. The heat across your tongue is immediate. The herbs sit high and floral, and beneath them the faintest note of something green and warm, like crushed walnut leaves in late summer. The swallow leaves a slow warmth behind the breastbone. You set your cup down and say that the reeve will be amicable. The mid-batch joke arrives by itself. You add that if he becomes too agreeable, you will request a discount on his measurements. She replies that if he becomes too agreeable, she will raise her price. Balance reasserts itself in this room as surely as in a ledger, a recorded truth to hold women brew much of the ale here. Alewives carry recipes like heirlooms, pass techniques like gossip, and keep a house afloat with the steady drip of coppers across the week. In some places, guilds watch them. In others, a churchman frowns and calls the trade unseemly. But the village drinks, and the village works, and the village sleeps because it drinks. That is the calculus of grain and water. She lowers the heat and covers the pan with a board. You watch the seam of steam thread out along the edge. A flow, oakened by the warmth, Mans thinks better of it, and staggers away like a drunk who promised not to come back. You check your pouch by habit, find the tiny feather you tucked there in the loft, and slip it to the window ledge. A small altar of stray usefulness grows there, a sprig of yarrow stem, a bent pin, a shard of salt glaze. The alewife glances at it once and says nothing. You wipe your hands against your tunic and feel the old tack of resin still in the creases. You ask her if she remembers when the tinker bragged about his never-boil-over pot. She does too. You both allow the shared smirk. The pot had boiled over within minutes, but although he swore it only did that to prove a point. Your end-of-section joke comes soft. You say the pot did prove a point, only not the one he intended. She answers, and yet he sold too, which is the kind of line that keeps a village both amused and fed. The side pan settles. She ladles the portion into a small keg and marks its lid with a single scratched line. Private stock for a private customer. The rest of the cauldron rumbles on toward ordinary ale for ordinary thirst. In the corner, several empty pitchers wait, their rims brushed with beeswax so they pour clean and don't dribble precious foam onto table boards. One of those humble habits passed down without anyone remembering when it started. You carry the marked keg to the threshold while she banks the fire and wipes the spoon. The light outside is clearer now. The sun at that height where shadows are stout and honest. Someone laughs near the well. A chicken complains. The mill wheel at the stream gives a dry squeak as the first sacks of grain arrive. You balance the keg on your hip and look back. The alewife has already turned to the next thing. A hand on the barm jar, a thought in the margin of her mind where she calculates wood, water, grain, and time. You step into the day with the quiet confidence of a task completed and another one set in motion. The reeve will have his calmer evening. The village will have its common cups. And you, resin still faint on your fingers, will have a story measured in sips and steam, in the steady arithmetic of herbs and honey. The path to the yard is familiar. The grinder's shed door stands ajar, the stone wheel gleaming in its stripe of light like an old moon. You breathe and keep walking. The market square smells of mud, wool, and frying batter. You step in from the lane, shifting the keg to your other arm, and find the usual scatter of stalls arranged in a lazy horseshoe. The merchant from the coast has already taken his favored corner, where the light falls on his wares just so. His table is a crowded map of curiosities, glazed jugs painted with curling vines, bundles of cinnamon bark tied with red twine, and a half-dozen small pipes of clay, their bowls rounded like acorns. You know those pipes. The merchant calls them imported, which is true in the loosest sense. Imported from 2 villages over, perhaps, though he swears the clay comes from across the narrow sea. He glances up as you pass, eyes sliding to the keg on your hip. You nod. He nods back, that slow tilt merchants use when they're trying to decide whether to invite a customer closer or let them stew in curiosity. A woman in a blue cap stands at his table, turning a pipe in her hands as if it might reveal its secrets under the right light. The merchant leans in, lowering his voice just enough to draw her closer. You hear only fragments pleasant drift, quiet thoughts, like a fire that stays in the mind. You suspect the phrases are practiced. They have the polished shine of lines used often enough to feel both true and not. You pause at the stall beside him, where a cooper sells small casks. One is half filled with some dark powder, not pepper, not soot. The cooper sees your glance and shrugs, and from the herbalist, he says, for pain. Then, quieter or for stories, if you take enough. Historians still argue whether such marketplace trades were open knowledge or shadowed exchanges. In truth, they're both hidden in plain sight, carried out with the same tone one might use for buying onions. The merchant's voice cuts through again. "A pipe like this, he says, and a pinch of the right leaf." He catches your eye. The woman in the blue cap follows his glance, then places the pipe back on the table. She thanks him and walks off toward the poulterer's stall. The merchant lets out a slow breath and says, "She'll be back." You don't ask if he means for the pipe or for the leaf. You edge closer to his table, setting the keg down for a moment to roll your shoulders. He slides one of the smaller pipes toward you. The clay is warm from the sun, smooth in the stem, rougher at the bowl. You turn it over. The bowl's interior is stained darker than the clay someone has tested it. A faint whiff rises from it, green and dry. You comment it lightly, that it's been seasoned already. He gives a little shrug and says, "Better than buying blind." From the far end of the square, the miller shouts something about his flour being weighed fairly. Someone answers with a laugh. The noise swells for a moment, then falls back into the hum of bargaining. A child runs past with a crust of bread in one hand and a chicken feather in the other. The feather drifts loose, catching briefly on your boot before the wind lifts it again. The merchant gestures to a small pouch near the pipes. It's tied with string, no label. You know the weight of such a thing before you even pick it up dense, soft, the contents shifting just enough to tell you they're dried leaves. He calls it a blend, half from his own fields, half from beyond the strait. Whether that's truth or theater is unclear. He names a price high enough to sound serious, but low enough to keep you from walking away. Your joke for the early trade slips in easily. You tell him you'd pay extra if the blend came with a guarantee that it wouldn't make the reeve sing psalms again. The merchant grins without asking for the story, which is just as well. Some memories belong to the people who lived them, and some are better left as rumors. The cooper at the next stall begins hammering a hoop into place, the rhythmic tap echoing across the square. You tuck the pouch into your belt, lift the keg, and let the noise carry you toward the far end, where the air smells of fresh bread and smoke. Along the way, you pass a stall selling beeswax candles painted with tiny scenes, a stag under a tree, a ship with its sails full, a tower against a round sun, and one candle shows a bundle of plants hanging in a loft, stalks downward, leaves curling. You wonder if the painter knew their shape or simply imagined them. The far edge of the square holds the fishmonger's table. His hands are red from the cold water in the tubs at his feet. He shouts greetings to passers-by and slipping small coins to children who will carry word of his freshest catch to their mothers. The smell here is sharp, cutting through the sweetness of the baker's stall next door. You turn back toward the lane, keg still steady on your hip, pouch warm against your side. The merchant has already drawn another curious customer to his table. The clay pipes lined like small soldiers awaiting inspection. By the time you leave the square, the sun has begun to lean toward afternoon, and the road back toward home feels longer than it should. A breeze carries the scent of something cooking herbs, maybe, or the faint trace of smoke from a clay pipe in some shaded yard. The first tendril reaches you at the gate, thin and curious, as if the yard itself has exhaled. You pause to let the scent pass over your face, warm clay, a green tinge, and the faintest bite like pepper rubbed on oak. Dinner lingers in it too, someone's onion stew marching steadily toward edible. You step through the wicket and hear a low ripple of conversation, that hum people make when they mean to be quiet and then forget. Your cousin is already there on the bench, his boots off, his socks attempting mutiny. He pats the plank beside him with the air of a man welcoming a lord, which would be impressive if he weren't also balancing a small clay bowl on his knee. The bowl glows at the rim where a coal sits, shouldered into the herb like a red moon into cloud. He grins and says he kept a coal live with a shard of potsherd, just like the tinker taught me. You answer that the tinker also taught a pot to boil over. Early joke logged in gentle. You set the keg down by the wall. The marked lid with its single scratched line catches the dusk. The alewife's private portion waits for the reeve, but this yard meets on its own terms. A low table holds a clay cup of water, a small beeswax candle you bought at market painted with a ship already puddling at the base, and a little dish of salt. The cat chooses the dish's shadow for a throne, curls into it like poured dough, and closes one eye in that careful way that suggests it is watching without admitting it. Your neighbor Wyman arrives with his careful sack, pretending it is lighter than anyone can see. From over the fence, the mill's wheel gives its evening squeak as the stream lessens and the paddles settle. Someone brings a reed stem whittled smooth. Someone else produces the smallest pipe from the merchant's table, its acorn bowl dark at the lip, its stem warmed between palms to keep it from cracking. Historians still argue whether handheld pipes like these sit honestly in our century or belong to the years that rush after, and whether folk here would more commonly have used small braziers or embers in dishes to scent the air. In this yard, the argument stays outside the gate. The bowl glows, the reed waits, and the evening thickens. You take your place and let the small rituals proceed. A coal from the hearth goes into the bowl. A pinch of the merchant's blend follows, crushed between forefinger and thumb. The reed fits the bowl mouth, not snug, but obedient, and the first tester draws lightly to stir the ember rather than scorch it. The breath returns to the yard with a slow sigh. People set down their day as if it were a bundle of sticks, careful, tidy, aware that tomorrow they will pick it up again. A true note for the night households often burned herbs in simple braziers to sweeten rooms, chase flies, or settle nerves. A few medical texts list cannabis among remedies for ache and sleep when mixed into poultices or wines. Someone mentions a cousin's cousin who rubbed hemp seed oil on stiff fingers and then claimed he could card wool twice as fast. Someone else answers that he could also talk twice as long, which is not the same improvement. The laughter is small and round. The smoke rides it and then disperses. The clay passes to you. The bowl is warm, is almost friendly, and a sweetness clings to the rim where the resin has met heat and decided to stay. You lift, draw, pause, nothing dramatic. Just a small persuasion of breath and taste, a green that reminds you of hedges in late summer after rain. The reed creaks faintly where it meets the bowl, like a door learning manners. When you let the breath go, it hangs in the cool yard and folds itself into the dark. For a moment, your shoulders forget the grinder's handle. Your jaw unbuttons. You hear the mill wheel again and think it sounds less like a chore and more like a story someone tells to make the night feel complete. The cat decides to tour everyone's ankles, a professional checking the perimeter. Or at the doorway, the little candle's painted ship seems to move as the flame tunnels the wax, sails filling, then emptying, then filling again. Women claims the ship will make port before the candle is done. Your cousin replies that if it follows the Reeves ledgers, it will circle twice and pay a harbor fee each time. Midsection joke placed, soft as linen. A breeze ruffles the hedge when The geese mutter from the lane like elders negotiating seating. Someone taps the clay to settle ash. You refill the reed's roll with a new pinch and pass the pair left, because left is the direction agreed 3 summers ago when this began. A rule as firm as the mark on the keg. The reed is one of the yard's recurring objects now, like the cat or the mill's squeak or the feather in your pouch, which you find yourself touching whenever the conversation thins. You turn the feather between finger and thumb. It records nothing, yet remembers everything. A small lift, an old woman from 2 houses down, steps through the gate, wiping her hands on her apron without caring if they are clean. She sits, not asking, and produces from her sleeve a tiny earthen dish with 3 holes in the side. For embers, she says. My mother called it a cresset, or a kitchen saint. She settles a coal inside and adds a thread of herb. Smoke seeps from the holes like whispers finding exits. She says it keeps midges away and tempers temper. You look at the dish and wonder how many cook fires it has seen. How many nights like this? Quirky object logged in welcome. You share the keg's ordinary ale in small cups, leaving the marked portion untouched. The first sips are cool, then warmer, then quiet. Your neighbor mentions a traveling tale in lands far east. Resins pressed and aged like cheese are wrapped in cloth and carried over mountains. Someone else says a sailor told him the same, only larger. Historians still argue whether such stories reached villages like yours in the form they began, or whether river mouths and market mouths bent them into friendlier shapes. The pipe returns. The bowl is nearly spent. You lift and draw again, and slower, a patient pull, and watch the ember hollow its little cave. The taste is darker now, like nuts toasted too long but saved at the last moment. Your hands have learned to move carefully. You press ash gently. You do not cough. You let the sound of the yard flow through you like water finding level the spoon at a neighbor's pot. The rattle of a gate, a dog choosing a new patch of ground to find old dreams. A fact returns with the smoke hemp is wind-pollinated and carries its own smell across fields when the air is right. You tell the yard that you saw a bee startled into visiting a male plant anyway, dusty with the wrong kind of interest. No one is surprised. The cat blinks as if to say the world is full of misdirected errands. The candleship lists. The reed cools. Someone proposes a last turn as the stars find their places. You agree, not out of greed but ritual. The ember makes its final red bead. Your cousin says, a very solemn, that he feels taller. You assure him the bench leg is sinking. End joke fitted like a good joint. The yard exhales as one. People stand slowly, as if waking from a nap they will not admit to. Clay bowls are emptied and rubbed clean with a corner of old linen. Ash is tucked into the herb bed because ash returns favors. The old woman pockets her cresset, nods at the cat, and departs through a gap in the hedge that no one else seems to find. Wyman tightens his sack, still pretending, still failing. The geese finally decide and go. You lift the keg and feel the day in your arms. The gate clicks behind you. In the lane, the mill's wheel offers one last brief squeak, less a complaint than a good night. Your fingers smell of clay and a green that is not a color but a thought. The reed rests in your sleeve, a sliver of evening saved for the next. The house waits with its banked fire and its quiet. The miller's door is unlatched, the smell of warm grain drifting into the lane like an open invitation. You step inside, your boots crunching over a scatter of flour on the threshold, and find him bent over the hearth, coaxing a lump of dough from the bowl with a wooden spoon. His sleeves are dusted to the elbows, his hairline holding a fine halo of flour that the light from the small window catches and turns silver. On the table sits a round loaf from yesterday, dark crust, dense weight, the kind that could double as a doorstop if it weren't meant for eating. A second, smaller loaf rests beside it, wrapped in cloth that doesn't entirely hide the green flecks in the crumb. You've seen that look before. The miller calls it seed cake for the sake of the parish clerk, though everyone who eats it knows the seeds in question are not caraway. He glances up when you enter, eyes bright in the dim room. "You're in time," he says, and nods at the wrapped loaf. You set your pouch on the bench, untying the cord, and tip a small pinch of the merchant's blend onto the table. The miller chuckles, that low, a satisfied sound of a man who already had the same idea. Midway through the year, when the hemp seed stores are high, he bakes these cakes for friends of the mill, a group defined as anyone who can keep a straight face when the parish clerk walks past. He folds the seeds into the dough, their pale shells catching the light. A fact you've heard him boast: hemp seeds in bread add oil and protein. A poor man's way of making a loaf richer without paying for more grain. Historians still argue whether the mind-loosening effect of such cakes was common knowledge or simply a side effect discovered on long winter evenings. Either way, in this mill, it's no accident. You help knead, the dough pushing back under your palms, the seeds catching in the folds. The miller sprinkles in a measure of dried leaf, just enough to tint the dough in spots, and works it through. "Subtle, he says, and is the way to keep it." He once baked a loaf too generous with its seasoning, and the entire afternoon's work at the mill wheel stopped because no one could remember the order of sacks. A soft knock interrupts you. It's Wyman, cradling a jug like it's a child. Trade he asked, I think. The miller glances at you, then nods. Wyman sets the jug down and receives in return a heel of last week's cake, wrapped in cloth. He leaves without a word, the jug's contents left unspoken, but guessed at a barter loop that runs on mutual understanding more than coin. While the dough rests, the miller fetches a plate of yesterday's loaf and slices it into neat wedges. The crumb is tight and speckled with seed, and smells faintly nutty with a greener note beneath. You take a bite. The crust cracks, the inside is heavy but not dry, and the seeds crunch gently between your teeth. The green taste blooms slowly, a warmth that is more thought than tongue. You say it's enough to make the reeve hum, which is your early joke. The miller laughs into his sleeve. In the corner, the millstones turn with their steady sigh, driven by the stream outside. The sound is almost conversational, a reminder that work ticks along whether or not you attend it. A sack of grain slumps against the wall, tied at the top with the same twine you used for the hemp bundles in the loft. The repetition pleases you. 2 threads from different corners of the village, tied with the same knot. The oven is ready. The miller slides the new loaf in beside one he's been baking since morning. The heat smells of rye, wood smoke, and the faint resinous note rising from the cake's flecks. He leans against the wall and wipes his hands on his apron. Some folk, he says, swear the seeds bring dreams. Not all of them restful. You mentioned the time your cousin swore he saw the parish clerk juggling apples in the churchyard. The miller answers that some dreams are better than sermons. Midsection joke secured. You sip from a mug of small beer, the kind brewed for daily thirst. Its thin tang clears the last of the flour dust from your throat. Through the open window, you can hear the market winding down, stalls being packed, chickens complaining as they're herded home, the clop of a single cart heading for the road east. The miller opens the oven to check the crust. The heat pushes into the room, making the air dense and sweet. He taps the top of the loaf with his knuckles. The sound is hollow, the sign he wanted. He pulls it out and sets it on the table and covers it with a cloth. This one, he says, is for tonight. You wrap a wedge of yesterday's loaf in your own cloth to carry home. The seeds shift inside, making a faint patter. You think of the Reeves keg waiting in the corner of your kitchen, the reed pipe in your sleeve, and now this cake, all threads in the same weaving, each to be pulled at the right time. The miller gives you a final nod, one baker to another of smaller, stranger things, and turns back to his work. You step into the fading light, the sound of the wheel following you until the lane bends. Your cousin will be waiting, and the cake will cut better once it's cooled, but the scent is already thick in the cloth. And joke slides in easy. You tell yourself the trick will be not eating it on the way, but you've never been good at that. Lanterns bloom in the square like low-hanging moons, their paper skins painted in patterns that ripple when the candle inside shifts. You arrive as the first wave of villagers begins to gather, weaving between benches and trestle tables while children dart in and out like loose chickens. The air smells of beeswax, damp earth, and the stew that the alewife has been feeding for hours, its scent curling up into the rafters of the night. Above the square, banners of faded cloth flutter between poles, their stitched symbols half lost to years of weather. A wheat sheaf here, a crooked star there, the memory of a stag's antlers in frayed thread. In the center, a brazier glows, and from it rises the distinct, green sweet smoke of someone's private blend. You don't have to see the source to know the hand that made it. Wyman has never been subtle. You thread through the crowd, passing a girl selling roasted chestnuts from a shallow pan. She offers you one with a shy nod. The shell cracks under your teeth, releasing a hot, flowery sweetness that holds just a shadow of the smoke drifting from the brazier. Historians still argue whether hemp was ever burned openly during festivals or kept to the quiet margins. Here, it seems to depend entirely on who has the brazier that year. Your cousin spots you from a bench and waves like he's calling a ship to port. He's already halfway through a cup, the rim stained darker than ale alone would make it. You sit, setting the miller's cake on the table between you. The cloth still holds the warmth from the oven. When you unwrap it, the seeds glint in the lantern light, and the smell turns heads at the next bench. You pretend not to notice it. In the brazier, a new pinch of herb sends up a ribbon of smoke. It catches the lantern light in strange ways, turning gold, then silver, then green again. The cat appears under the table, brushing against your ankles like a whispered suggestion. You pass it a crumb from the chestnut, which it accepts with the solemnity of a judge. A fiddler starts up near the alewife's stall, the tune quick and sharp enough to make your heel tap before you notice. The reeve arrives a moment later, carrying his marked keg under one arm. His face softens when he spots the alewife, and she hands him a cup without a word. Early joke for the night, you remark to your cousin that the reeve's shoulders just drop the width of a thumb, which means he's only 2 sips away from ignoring the missing goose count. The crowd thickens. Someone releases a lantern into the air, a larger one, framed with thin willow, its painted sides showing a stag and a ship locked in some story you'll never quite hear. It rises slowly, gathering itself against the night chill before catching a warmer current and floating higher. Eyes follow it, and for a moment the square feels like it's breathing together. The miller arrives with his own wedge of cake, wrapped in cloth that doesn't hide the flecks of green. He sits, cuts it into smaller pieces and passes them out without ceremony. The taste is even better under lantern light, nutty, warm, with that faint, peculiar bloom at the back of the throat. Conversations loosen. Laughter comes more easily. The fiddler's tune slows to something more swaying than tapping. From the far side of the square, the herbalist approaches carrying a small bundle tied with ribbon. She lays it on the table and unties it to reveal 3 narrow sticks of incense, each darkened at the tip where they were tested. She plants one in the ash beside the brazier, and a new scent threads into the mix, floral, almost grassy, but with that familiar undertone that makes people lean a little closer without realizing it. Quirky fact tucked in: some medieval households used incense to mask the smell of stronger herbs, claiming it was for the angels, though who believed that is unclear. Your cousin stands to fetch more cups, weaving slightly as he moves. The reeve joins the fiddler in clapping to the rhythm, offbeat but determined. You glance at the lanterns overhead, their shadows shifting across the ground like slow water. The cat hops onto the bench beside you, nose twitching at the incense. A sudden cheer breaks out near the well. A boy has caught the goose that escaped last week, or at least one that looks close enough. The bird honks indignantly as it's paraded through the square. Midsection joke slips in. You tell the miller it's remarkable how the reeve's missing goose has aged a year and fattened in a fortnight. As night deepens, the lanterns grow warmer against the dark. People settle into smaller clusters, their talk dipping to murmurs between bursts of laughter. You take another slice of cake, and slower this time, and let the resin's warmth creep in with the ale. The music changes again, softening to something almost like a lullaby. The herbalist leans over to tell you about a shipment due from the east, wrapped in silk and smelling, she claims, of pine and honey. Whether that's a trade route or a bedtime story, you're not sure, but you nod and tuck it away in memory. Across the square, Wyman feeds the brazier again, and a fresh plume of green gold smoke rises, catching the eyes of anyone not already lost in their own small conversation. By the time the last of the lanterns are lit, the square feels smaller, cozier, as if the light has drawn the edges inward. You think about the reed pipe waiting at home, the miller's cake cooling in its cloth, and the way the reeve will walk back tonight with a slower step than usual. End joke lands soft. You tell yourself the goose will be there to greet him, ready to file another complaint. The goose honks again as you leave the square, its protest fading into the night air that smells of wax and stew. Bells answer from uphill, 3 slow notes pulling your feet toward the priory where the fields give way to walls. The path is damp, packed by cartwheels, and your boots find the ruts by memory. A small wind lifts, brushing lantern smoke from your cloak and swapping it for the clean, resin-laced breath that drifts from the monk's garden. Early joke, barely a smile. You tell yourself the bells are for Compline, though the goose clearly believes they are for it personally. At the gate, a A lay brother nods you through. He carries a basket of rushlights, their tallow rims nicked at thumb's width to mark off the hours. Past the cloister walk, the priory settles into its own kind of hush, not silence exactly, but a layered patience footfalls on stone, a door setting gently, the soft hiss of a brazier accepting a new coal. You follow that last sound to a narrow stair and then to a chamber where one candle has been coaxed into doing the work of three. The monk inside raises his head from a page, crinkling. You've brought him seed and paper before, and once a coil of good hemp rope for the well. Tonight you've brought nothing but your quiet, and that is enough, because he waves you to the stool near the brazier and reaches for a small cone of incense, darker than frankincense and dusted with something green. It touches the coal, awakens, and lets go a thin thread of smoke that curls like script. It is not loud. It is there the way dusk is there. The chamber smells of vellum, glue, and lamp oil. The monk's desk is a squat lectern of oak, and on it sits a quire of parchment sheets, stretched smooth and pinned by pebbles worked to pleasing roundness by the stream. A quill rests in a horn cup. An inkstone waits in a shallow dish beside a pumice pebble and a rag for sanding and dabbing. The margins of the current page have life, a vine that will soon hold gold leaf, a rabbit testing the edge of the frame, an initial that is half-drawn breath. He murmurs a welcome and returns to his line. The nib scritches de-te. The incense unfurls. Your shoulders settle the way they did in the yard, but slower, as if weight were a shy guest learning the room before sitting. A mainstream fact settles with you. Monasteries keep physic gardens, tidy squares of walled earth where monks tend simple sage, rosemary, yarrow, and palm in some places, hemp for poultices, cordage, lamp wicks, and the odd medicament set down in herbals. The monk gestures with his quill toward the window ledge, where stems hang to dry above a tray of lavender. For moths, he says, and for chins that will not stop talking. You nod at the first use and pretend to know nothing about the second. He pauses to sand a line with fine dust. Historians still argue whether these smokes are prayer or plaster, he says softly, meaning whether the herbs are incense for the soul or merely medicine for hands, heads, and hungry midges. He circles the brazier with a palm, coaxing the air, then lifts a small clay lid and sets it to temper the thread. Under the lid, the scent softens, turns less like a hedge and more like the memory of one. You look down and notice a page at your feet, set aside to dry. A cat's paw has tested its lower margin. 4 little prints, forever curious. The monk smiles without looking. He edits, he says, and you agree that many editors leave heavier marks. Quirky tidbit tucked in some pages here carry curses against book thieves. Small neat threats promising that the binder's thread will knot in the stomach of any who steal. The monk does not write those, he says, but he admires their efficiency. A lift comes quietly. He reaches into a shallow drawer and withdraws a narrow packet wrapped in linen. Inside lies a tiny bottle, resinous and dark, thick as old honey. He does not open it. He only sets it where the fire can see it and says it is for aching joints when winter keeps score. A grain on a cloth, he adds, no more. You think of the alewife's careful portions, the miller's seeds, your reed. The village speaks one grammar in many dialects. The quill takes another sip of ink. He writes the end of a sentence and breathes it in, as if to keep it from running off the page. But you hear, in the next cell, the brief slide of a stool, and beyond that, water in a cistern taking its time. On the wall, a loop of rope hangs, hemp braided tight, ready for the well. Your eyes follow its twist to the knot, then to the feather in your pouch, which you take out almost without thinking. You lay it on the desk edge. The monk's gaze softens. He turns it once, approving of nothing and everything, then wedges it between 2 pebbles so it will not wander. He shows you his penknife, the edge bright but not boastful. A quill is trimmed to suit the hand rather than the other way round, he says. He nips the nib, salts it with a lick, and tests it on a scrap that reads nothing but the pressure of the moment. Most people imagine angels, he says with a thin smile. Mostly we imagine margins for it. Midway humor comes in like a monk through a door, quiet, inevitable. He says the prior once banned strong incense before matins, as it made the brothers generous with the psalms and stingy with the pauses. You hazard that the goose in the square felt likewise about bells. He grants you half a laugh, which in here is abundant. You watch him lay bowl, a clay underlayer for gold, with a brush no thicker than a moth's leg. He moistens breath under the leaf, and it answers, easing down to lie where placed. The candle gives back a thread of light so small and exact it could be a needle. The smoke belts it loosely. Your thoughts stretch, not far, just enough to feel their joints again. The monk speaks of a traveling codex, a book that smelled of salt and pine and, faintly, the same green sweetness that now sits under his lid, came with a trader in spring, wrapped in silk, written in a hand both stern and dancing. He does not say where from. He does not need to. Traders speak in curves. He sets his quill across the cup and flexes his fingers. There is a debate, he adds, whether such plants accompany prayer, or whether prayer excuses them after the fact. He glances at the brazier. I am fond of both sides when my head aches. A rushlight gutters. He pinches it gently, trims the char with thumb and knife, and the light steadies. He nods at your sleeve. Still keep the little reed. You slide it out a sliver of the yard in a room of ink and lay it next to the feather. The room feels briefly like a place where lanes and cloisters shook hands long ago and never quite let go. A line appears in the margin of the page beneath his palm, a ship rounded like the candle you bought. Sails full. He pretends he did not notice your glance and says he sometimes adds what he hears while he writes. Last week a chicken, he says, but I sanded him out. He pauses, then adds, he will only return. End of section. Joke will bow later. You let this one drift for now. The incense has gone low. A few bright seeds winking in ash. He lifts the lid, breathes the last of it, and caps the brazier. The air in the chamber lightens but does not thin. You see the steadying effect of routine sand, knife, quill, breath, bell, and the gentle herb that seats thoughts the way a stone seats a door against wind. He writes another line. You do not read it. You listen instead to the small sounds that prove a place alive. Before you go, the monk reaches to a shelf and brings down a scrap with a neat hand on it. The Chilling Historian. Bedtime history tales, copied as he heard you say it once and tucked into the corner like a colophon in a book that will never leave this room. Those are anchors, he says. Uneven for tales. You place the scrap back with its fellows and make no promises about where tales begin or end. He walks you to the stair, palm grazing the hemp rope as you pass. At the gate, the lay brother nicks another thumb's width off a rushlight. Somewhere below, the goose remembers a grievance bit. You step into the night, pocket smelling of ink and green smoke, the feather a small white moon beside your reed. The village hum waits down slope. The priory hums behind you. You balance both on your tongue like a word that means two things. End joke arrives with the wind. Brief and local, you think the goose will file a formal complaint with the prior about incense hours, but you suspect the cat will intercept the paperwork. The well is busy before dawn, its wooden frame slick with the dew that has crept in from the fields. You arrive with your bucket just as two women are arguing over whose turn it is. Their voices low but sharp enough to shave bark. The rope squeals against the winch, the sound cutting through the mist like a dull knife. You take your place at the edge, keeping an ear open not to the quarrel, but to the murmur that hums in every corner of the village when nothing official is being said. A boy in a patched tunic leans on the post, pretending to guard the rope while actually scanning for an audience. When he sees you, his grin widens, clearly. He has a story ready. Sailors in the harbor, he says, selling leaf black as night. They wrap it in wax cloth so it stays soft, strong enough to make you forget you're seasick. He gestures toward the east, where the river runs wide and brown toward the distant coast. A cooper's wife draws her water and adds her own. I've heard of that. From the south. They say it makes you see saints or thieves, depending to. Historians still argue whether such travelers' tales carried more truth than embroidery, or whether the details shifted each time they hopped from one mouth to the next. You've learned the first telling is often modest, and the second sprouted wings. Your cousin arrives with a bucket over one shoulder, his expression already suggesting he's been listening elsewhere. There's a man at the crossroads, he says, claims he can pack a whole summer into a lump no bigger than your thumb. Early joke lands here. You tell him you've seen him do that before with cheese. The gossip drips as steadily as the water from each lifted bucket. A miller's boy mentions hearing of a blend laced with crushed rose petals, so the smell makes you dizzy before you've even drawn breath. A baker's apprentice swears that in a port 2 days west, they grind the leaf into honey cakes so rich the priest locks the door before cutting his share. Someone else adds that the same port had to change the locks twice. You lower your bucket into the dark circle of the well. The splash comes muted, as if the water is already half asleep. When you haul it up, the rope leaves faint ridges on your palms, and the bucket's chill seeps into your fingers. The boy at the post peers in, perhaps hoping for a glimpse of something exotic. He gets only his own reflection and frowns as if cheated. Beside you, 2 older men speak in the coded half-sentences of people who've already agreed on the rest. Same pouch as before, one asks. Near enough, the other replies. Smoother. Keeps the tongue moving. You don't need the whole story to know the sort of pouch they mean. One woman claims her uncle met a trader from lands beyond the steppe who carried pressed resin in the lining of his saddle. Another says she once tasted a draft steeped with a pinch from that very same saddle. Though how both stories can be true is a knot no one here bothers to untie. Midway through the queue, Wyman drifts in, his sack tucked tight under his arm as if water weighs that way. He nods to you but doesn't linger. The rope on his bucket is newer than most, hemp fibers bright and smooth. It makes you think of the loft and the bundles swaying there, and how much of the village's talk loops back to those same stalks in the end. The boy at the post, seeing his audience thin, tries one last volley. I heard in the east they mix it with mint, so the air smells cool even in summer. The cooper's wife laughs and says, if that were true, the traders would charge twice. Midsection joke slides in. You add that here, they'd just tell you it was for your health and make you work twice. A gust pushes the mist across the square, carrying with it a faint sweetness from some unseen brazier. It's not strong enough to mark the source, but you see the woman ahead of you pause, sniff, and glance toward the alley by the alewives. The gossip knot begins to loosen, buckets are lifted, handles creak, and people peel away in 2s and 3s. Your cousin balances his full bucket on one hip, the other hand adjusting his sleeve. You think the sailors will come this far upriver, he asks. You tell him they always come this far, whether by boat or by rumor. The trick is knowing which to believe. The last of the water is drawn, and the well stands quiet again. The post leans slightly in the damp earth, its rope coiled in a loose spiral that will tighten with the next morning's hands. You sling your own bucket, its weight swaying against your leg, and take the long way home. Along the lane, you pass the cat stalking something invisible in the grass, its tail twitching with more patience than you'll ever manage. By the time you reach your door, the mist is breaking into strands, and the first sunlight slides over the ridge. End joke finds its place. You tell yourself the goose is probably at the harbor right now, negotiating a price for black leaf and a new lock for the church. Your door answers the latch with a wooden sigh, and the chill that followed you from the well sidles in before you can push it back out. You set the bucket near the hearth where the last coals sit like small eyes in ash. The room smells of wool, mobbage, and the tail end of yesterday's smoke. On the table, the miller's cake waits under its cloth. The cat has arranged itself beside it as if hired to guard, which would be impressive if it weren't already asleep. You tell the cat the goose has gone to sea to buy locks and leaves, and it flicks one ear, which is as much enthusiasm as you deserve this cold. You kneel and tease a coal to life. feeding it with split kindling and a twist of straw. The reed you kept in your sleeve all day reappears, freshened as an old friend and outside. The light thins to that winter color that is not exactly blue and not exactly gray, more like the sky decided to save its strength. You draw the shutters, settle the bar, and turn the room into a small world with a glowing center. The brazier comes out from under the bench, a shallow iron bowl with 3 legs that make it look like a spider that learned manners. You tip in a scoop of coals from the hearth, then lay 1 dry hemp stem over the top, just to scent the air and keep the ember honest. A clean glow lifts, the kind that does not shout but insists. Threads of smoke tuck themselves into the rafters like shy guests. Early joke arrives with your breath. You tell yourself the brazier is friendlier than the bed, which is true, though the bed never asks for more kindling. You slice the cake and set 2 pieces on the board. One goes to your cousin when he slips through the door with the last of the day on his boots. He looks taller, which could be the reed in his sleeve or the frost in his hair. He shakes the cold off his shoulders and kneels beside the brazier to hold his hands over the slow glow. You pass him the small cup and the reed follows, set gently across the rim like a note folded and saved. The room gathers layers of quiet work. You check the rushlight, trim the char with the little knife, and move it 1 finger's width along the sconce to mark the hour. A mainstream fact settles easily into the warmth curfew bells in many towns call people home at dusk. A habit meant to limit fire and mischief, and houses answer by banking embers under ash to carry heat into morning. You've known the trick since you could hold a shovel. Tonight the brazier needs less help. The hemp stem adds its own steady nudge to the coals. The cat wakes, performs the ritual of deciding to be awake, then pads to the brazier to present a paw to the heat. It stares into the bowl like a prophet and then sneezes, offended by prophecy. You scatter a pinch of the merchant's blend into a little clay dish with holes your neighbor's old cresset and set it close enough for the ember to catch. The smoke is soft, green sweet with a nutty edge from the cake, and quickly turns the room into an agreeable version of itself. You lean back against the settle, feeling the grain of the wood map your spine, and let your breath choose the longer road. Your cousin starts a story about the miller's boy dreaming that the millstones turned themselves and demanded a share of the flour. You counter with the herbalist's rumor of a resin pressed into a tile that smells of pine and honey when warmed in the hand. Historians still argue whether such pressed resins traveled to villages like yours in these years, or whether those are later comforts folded backward by traders who preferred generous timelines. The ember cares little for chronology. It glows, offers, and keeps its counsel. A lift comes when the wind pushes against the shutters and the bar answers with a small thud. You both look up, then laugh for no reason except that you're warm and the wind is not. You speak of winter work that moves indoors spinning, patching, counting beans and blessings, and of how hemp herds, the woody leftovers, sometimes find their way into bedding to bulk it soft for cold nights. Quirky tidbit to pocket some neighbors, warm flat stones by the hearth and slip them into the bed's foot like obedient pets. If the stone hisses, the bed listens. The reed passes again. The ember in the cresset is cooperative, not fierce. You draw lightly to stir it and return the breath in a long ribbon that takes its time learning the corner of the room where it will rest. Your eyes adjust to the braiding of shadow and light rushlight's small sun, brazier's low moon, ember's red star that blinks and will not say why. The ship on your candle, tunneled deep, lists toward harbor and then away again as the draft shifts. You think the monk would draw it in a margin, then sand it out, then draw it again. From the hearth hook, a small pot ticks as what little stew remains decides whether to surrender more flavor. You add a spoon of water and a pinch of salt. The scent that rises answers to the cake in a language of cupboards and winter's cabbage, reconsidered. Onion repenting, barley content to be barley. Your cousin says the reeve took his calmer cup and measured the geese twice, then lost count laughing. Midsection joke lands easy. You answer that he should count the goose at sea twice to cover tides. The cat relocates to your lap without permission and kneads your tunic like bread that offended it. You endure. Your hands smell faintly of resin even after washing, and when you lift them to the brazier you can see the tack gleam in the creases like remembered sap. The moment lengthens. Stories expand to fit their containers. You speak of the ship painter's candle from market and of the monk's feather pinned between two pebbles. The objects that recur in your days read. Feather, ship, cresset feel like small stones laid in a pattern you recognize without naming. A soft debate turns around the room. Slow as smoke, whether the herb in the brazier sweetens the air for sleep or invites too many doors to stay open in the mind. You admit that some nights the dreams are crowded as feast benches, other nights as bare as Lent. Historians still argue whether people in your century sought these crowded dreams or stumbled into them through kitchens and cures. You suspect the answer is like winter light, both and neither, depending on where you stand. You tilt the cresset and tap ash into the hearth. The glow sharpens, then recovers. Your cousin tells of a man who swore he saw the prior's cat reading over a shoulder in the scriptorium. You say you believe it, provided the script was about fish. The room agrees in silence. It is easier to agree with warm hands. The rushlight shortens to its last inch. You shave it neatly, plant a fresh one, and give the new flame a moment to understand the room it has joined. Outside, hooves pass, slow and careful, and a driver clucks to his horse as if it were a friend who likes to be told about corners. The wind loses interest in your shutters. The brazier hums its small song. The last lift is gentler still. You fetch the coil of hemp rope you promised the monk for the well and set it near the door so you will not forget at dawn. The fibers are tight and clean, the twist perfect enough to make you proud. You touch the rope, then the feather in your pouch, then the reed, and feel the day arrange itself into a line you could follow in the dark. The ember reflects in the iron rim like a round eye closing. You share the end of the cake, little crumbs rescuing themselves from the board to your fingers. The cresset's ember fades to a polite memory. Your cousin stands, stretches, and says he feels lighter, which you attribute to the missing half of the loaf. End of section. Joke folds in with the blanket. You tell him if he gets any lighter, the wind will take him, and you will have to tie him to the bed like a stone. You bank the brazier, ash over coal, and lift the bar just enough to smell the night cold, honest and patient. The cat makes a small burr of sound and claims the warmest dent on the palate. You slip into the other, cloak over blanket, boots by the door like two small guards who never see action. The room exhales. Your breath answers. The glow under ash dims to a thought. The reed sleeps in your sleeve. The feather remembers the monk's pebbles. The ship candle gutters once and then chooses stillness. Outside, the stream nudges the mill wheel a finger's breadth, enough to say time is not stopped, only slowed. Inside, stories blur at their edges until they are snug against sleep. The herbalist's door is unlatched, which in her case means she's expecting someone or something, or at least curious enough to let either in. The hinges creak with that long, slow voice of wood that's learned patience. Inside, the air is heavier than the street, pressed with the smells of drying roots, old parchment labels, and the faint bitterness of something being ground just out of sight. You step across the threshold and catch her bent over a low bench, the pestle in her hand making its small circles in the mortar. Her sleeves are rolled to the elbow, the creases in her forearms powdered with dust from whatever she's working. She glances up, nods once, then tips the contents into a square of linen. The dust is pale green with a scatter of darker flecks. She folds the linen into a pouch and tucks it into a larger bundle on the shelf, where other little packets lie in neat disorder. Some are tied with twine, others with ribbon, and one with what looks suspiciously like stripped hemp fiber. You've seen her work with every plant from thyme to henbane, though she has a particular fondness for hemp seeds, leaves, resin, stalk, each finding its way into something that claims to cure or comfort. Historians still argue whether herbalists like her were considered healers first and dealers in small indulgences second, or whether the order shifted depending on who was asking. She doesn't seem to care which story people tell, so long as they keep the door open. From the rafters, bundles hang head down lavender, rosemary, chamomile, hemp flowers among them. Their scents mingle until it's hard to tell where one ends and another begins. She gestures toward the back table, where a little clay dish holds a blackish lump pressed flat like a biscuit. Oil pressed with resin chadis, she says. Keeps longer that way. She slices off a sliver with a small knife, the edge catching in the sticky grain, and drops it into a cup of steaming broth on the hearth. Early joke comes when she pushes the cup toward you and says, "It's for clarity of mind." You sniff it and tell her you'll drink it once you decide whether that's a blessing or a threat. She almost smiles, which is as much as you'll get. The walls here are lined with narrow shelves holding jars of dried petals, bowls of seeds, and small bottles of oil so thick they move like syrup. Some jars are labeled in her neat script, others in a scrawl you suspect is meant to keep casual eyes from guessing too quickly. A curious fact you once overheard her admit: certain oils, when warmed, smell so alike that she's labeled them by weight instead of name to keep from mixing them up. She moves to the larger mortar by the window, where sunlight catches in the fine dust rising from each turn of the pestle. Into this, she tips a measure of hemp seed, a pinch of ground willow bark, and something she won't name. The smell shifts from grassy to sharp and back again. For joints, she says, and for patience. She doesn't specify which kind of joints, and you don't add the. Midway through, a knock comes at the door. Wyman leans in, his sack slung lower than usual, and asks if she has anything for sleep that doesn't argue with the belly. She nods toward a jar on the top shelf, and he takes it down carefully, leaving a coin in the bowl near the door without waiting for her to count it. Transactions here often move at that quiet speed, nothing announced, nothing refused. She pours the ground mixture into a small glazed pot, caps it with waxed cloth, and seals the edge with string. The pot joins others on the shelf, each marked with a small charcoal glyph rather than a word. You know the one shaped like a leaf's shadow means hemp in some form, but you've never said so aloud. A lift comes when she pulls a narrow box from under the bench. Inside are thin sheets of pressed herbs, layered like pages, their colors muted but still distinct pale green, dusky yellow, brown edged with purple. She says they're for steeping in wine or ale. Each sheet folded once and slipped into the cup so the drinker knows exactly how much they're taking. You imagine the alewife approving of that precision, though perhaps not of the competition. The cat chooses this moment to slip in through the open door, tail high, heading straight for the hearth. It curls in front of the embers and blinks at you both as though it's here to supervise. She reaches into a jar and tosses it a scrap of dried fish. The cat accepts with the dignity of a favored guest. She sets a small wooden box on the bench before you. Inside, nestled in straw, are 3 little glass vials, each filled with oil the color of old gold. Infused, she says simply. The first smells of rosemary, the second of something like pine, the third of the familiar green-sweet note that drifts through the yard on long evenings. You ask what they're for. She answers, for trade, for trouble, for trust, which is no answer at all, but you take it. Midsection joke slides in when she points to the third vial and says it should be used sparingly. You tell her that's exactly what the miller said about his cake before cutting you 2 slices. She huffs, which might be a laugh hiding under a scold. The sunlight shifts across the floor, catching on the dust motes and the faint curl of steam from the broth she gave you. It tastes of herbs, yes, but also of something rounder, steadier, that leaves your mouth warm and your thoughts just loose enough to notice the smell of the hemp hanging above. She wraps a small bundle for you 2 pressed sheets, a pinch of seed, and a twist of dried leaf, and tucks it into your pouch without ceremony. For later, she says, though whether that means tonight or winter, you can't tell. The cat rises, stretches as though the room has been working for it, and follows you to the door. And outside, the air feels thinner, like a page turned after a long paragraph. You look back once to see her already bent over the bench again, the pestle circling, the bundles above her head swaying faintly in the current from the open door. End of section. Joke lands quiet. You tell yourself if the goose ever wandered in here, she'd send it out with a vial and instructions to steep itself. You hear the ship before you see it, a low groan of timber turning against river current, then the soft clatter of blocks answering the wind. The morning is thin and clean, a pale coin of sun hammered flat against a sky that still smells of frost. You walk the towpath with your reed tucked in your sleeve, the feather safe in your pouch, and the coil of hemp rope slung across your shoulder for the monk's well. Early joke earns a private smile. You tell yourself you're bringing rope to a river and stories to a ship, which is generous on both counts. To the bend, the bank widens to the little landing where traders favor your village when the water runs kindly. Today a broad-bellied riverboat noses in, her hull tar-dark and her painted eyes flaking but intent. The cat from nowhere leaps from a mooring post to the deck like it owns the boat and then pretends it merely inspected it. Two sailors catch the thrown line, and the smell reaches you in a layered piece of their world pitch, wet oak, wool that is known weather, and a sweetness you felt already in rumor, a resin scent like pine remembering summer. The master steps ashore, cloak lined with fur chewed by salt and thyme. He speaks the river dialect with a coast slant, and the reeve, jaw already less stern from last night's cup, meets him with a ledger under one arm. The first trade will be honest things: sacks of rye for bars of iron, salt for hides, a jar of honey to refill the ship's barm. Goddess good meeting goddess good. You wait with a respectful patience learned from markets and mills, listening to the ship itself settle against the bank with a satisfied creak. When the larger business thins, the smaller begins. A sailor with a scar like a stitch along his brow hauls a small chest wrapped in greased cloth and nailed at the corners with copper. The cloth is sheepskin turned in, proof against damp. He lays it on a plank and lifts the lid. Inside, linen parcels lie snug as loaves, each bound with a red thread and labeled in a brisk hand. When he opens one, the scent stands up and looks around, dark sweet, woody, with that green undertone you know from the yard and the herbalist's bench, only deeper, as if time had been pressed into it. From east of east, he says, because traders speak in curves. The inside of each parcel shows a cake of resin, flattened and scored so it breaks clean. A fleck shines where the knife tried and the resin answered. You have heard this described in the square, and again by lantern, and again at the well. Now it sits on a plank near your boots, wrapped in silk that remembers a road you'll never walk. Historians still argue whether such pressed resins made it often into villages like yours in these years, or whether they stayed with port cities and court curiosities until later. The plank doesn't argue. It holds the cake while the reeve pretends not to see. The sailor offers a shaving no larger than a fingernail. He warms it between his fingers. It loosens and shines and releases a note like honey that learned to read. He folds it into a bit of wool and touches it to an ember in a travel brazier the size of a palm. A thin ribbon rises and then decides to stay, as smoke sometimes does when it likes a place. You taste it by being near it, the way you taste sea salt by standing on the quay too long. It carries those same hints the herbalist guessed: pine and something like sun-warmed straw, but also a shadowed sweetness you can't place except in the word old. The barter here honors your river-salted fish stacked in wicker panniers for parcels of this dark, neat treasure. The alewife arrives with a crock and trades a measure of barm for a ribbon of silk from a wrapping for a saint's day, she says, but the smile at her lip is for a private shelf. The miller sends his boy with 2 loaves and returns with a parcel no larger than a goose egg, which he will fold into the mill's secrets with a care that looks like prayer. A mainstream fact steps aboard easily river routes, knit markets long before good roads do. Boats like this one carry iron, salt, wax, pepper, and tails up and down their water. So villages learn the shape of far things by smell first and coin second. You have seen Baltic wax arrive like captured sunlight. You have seen pepper trickle into stew and make winter remember heat. Now you see resin wrapped in silk find a place in the same grammar. The sailor with the stitched brow tells you the cake keeps soft under waxed linen and stays friendly and cold when tallow is rubbed on the outside, an old trick from someone who smuggled warmth past a winter tantrum. Quirky aside, offered with a grin, he swears one captain swaddled his parcel in carded wool and hid it under his dog's blanket, arguing that no customs man quarrels with a sleeping dog. You do not ask about cats. Your cousin appears from the path with a pannier that smells of last year's fish, which is the point. He negotiates the old way by weight, by look, by the small theater of pretending to walk away. The sailor responds with the older way he shrugs like a man whose time is a private island. They settle when the reeve clears his throat in a key both have heard since childhood. You take your turn, shy of coin and rich in barter. The coil on your shoulder is hemp braided without error, the kind a well deserves and a ship respects. The master tests it with a pull, then with a twist, then with an eye. He names a fair exchange a parcel the size of your palm and a smaller strip besides. For binding, he says, meaning thanks. Midsection joke sets itself down. You say the rope will keep his mast upright if his stories don't tip it first. He laughs with his teeth, which makes it count. He shows you a pouch of ground leaf as well, the crumble darker than your grinder's yield, sticky to the touch. For steeps, he says, and tapping the pouch, cakes or cakes, if you have a miller with opinions. You do, and the pouch's weight tells you it might fill a winter with careful evenings. The reeve, trying to be formal while pocketing informality, asks the sailor where the road begins for such cakes. The sailor lists names that tilt your ear towns, whose walls hear Arabic and Greek in the same hour. Islands where resin smells mingle with tar and orange peel. Caravan rests where silk and stories share shade. He says a physician showed him a page that wrote the plant for ache and gloom and sleep in a hand neat as a church threat, and that the page smelled faintly of the same smoke as now. A scholar's nose, he adds, is a fair compass, provided the wind suits it. You think of the monk's lid over incense, a thumb of peace measured by a careful hand. You barter your salted fish through the cooper's wife, who knows the numbers and does not tolerate drift. Fish goes out. Silk parcels come in. The alewife marks one with a fingernail and hides it in her sleeve. The herbalist arrives late, nods once, and receives a tiny bottle dark as peat that the sailor uncorks only long enough to prove its ancestry. She nods again, tucks it away, and vanishes the way some people do when they have already catalogued the room. Gulls argue overhead with a seriousness they never spend on useful things. The cat deigns to inspect the parcel you have earned, tapping it once as if to sign the bill. The ship's boy mistakes your feather for a quill and asks if you write orders. You hand him the reed instead and tell him it writes only evenings. He shakes it, hears nothing, and pronounces it plausible. A small lift, the master opens a second chest and reveals a handful of narrow cones cast of resin and spice, meant to be burned in a dish that seeds light from 3 holes. The old woman with the cresset emerges from nobody knows where and buys one with a coin she must have been keeping in a hem since spring. She holds the cone to her nose and closes her eyes, like someone remembering a door they might have walked through. Historians still argue whether our grandfathers would have known this smell. The reeve says softly to no one, then corrects himself, or whether we are the first fools to call it familiar. He has a parcel now, too, marked with the same red thread, and he looks less like an officer than a man with winter plans. The sun climbs the notch in the ridge. The boaters stow what must be stowed. The boy casts off the aft line and pretends it takes more strength than it does, a rehearsal for a life that will soon be real. You tuck your parcel inside your tunic where the warmth will keep it pliant. You smell pine and honey again, or decide you do, which may be the same thing. As the ship leans back into the river, the master nods at your coil, at your village, at the ways small places learn large scents. He raises a palm. Not quite a wave, more a ledger balanced fish for resin, rope for tail, winter for a spring that will arrive precisely when it does. End of section joke leaves the bank with you. You decide the goose will tell everyone it negotiated the rate. then complain that no one paid it in full. You turn toward the lane, parcel snug, reed patient, feather light, the rope still on your shoulder because the monk's well waits. Behind you, the boat swings into the current, and the painted eyes on her bow glance once, as if to remember you. The water closes over the place she was with barely a line to mark it. The smell, pitch, and salt and that dark sweetness stays a moment longer, like a word the mouth shapes after the name is gone. The thaw begins in patches, as if the earth has decided to loosen its grip only where it feels like it. You walk the ridge path with the coil of rope finally delivered to the monk's well, your pouch lighter for trades and heavier for what you've tucked away. Down in the lower fields, strips of soil show dark against the last crusts of snow, and the air smells of damp loam and last year's stalks. You can hear water talking under the ice in the ditches, the sound a soft, busy whisper. Near the far hedge, green points push up through the softened ground, first the stubborn weeds, then the shoots you've been waiting for. Hemp seedlings, small in earnest, wearing their first leaves like badges. You crouch and pinch one gently between finger and thumb. The leaf edges are already serrated, miniature copies of the summer giants they'll become. Early joke lands easy, you tell yourself they're like the Reeves handwriting small now, but bound to get messier with age. You pull a leather pouch from your belt and scatter a pinch of save seed into the loam between rows. The miller gave you extra this year for quality, though he smirked when he said it. And you're not sure if that means taller stalks or livelier evenings. A mainstream fact rises with the morning mist. Hemp is sown in spring when the frost has mostly passed, but the soil still holds its cold. The chill said to encourage sturdier plants. Rows are marked with a stick and twine, the same twine you used for bundles in the loft. In the next row, Wymond is already on his knees, poking seeds into earth with a rhythm that could be prayer or boredom. His sack lies open beside him, and you note the darker flecks in his seed mix leaf crumble from last season. Perhaps, or something traded from the sailor's parcel. Historians still argue whether mixing last year's leaf into the seed bed is superstition, fertilizer, or simply thrift dressed up as tradition. Wymond will tell you it teaches the young plants their manners. The cat pads between the rows, picking its way like a duchess avoiding puddles. It stops to sniff at one seedling, sneezes once, and moves on. You glance toward the hedgerow, where the old woman with the cresset stands watching. She nods at your scattering and calls out that she's planted hers near the south wall for a sweeter leaf. You nod back, making a mental note, though whether it's the wall, the sun, or the telling that does the trick is anyone's guess. The soil here is soft enough to work by hand. You loosen the clumps with your fingers, the cold sinking into your nails. The shoots are spaced to give each plant room to stretch, but close enough to shade out weeds. You find yourself thinking of the loft again, the smell of drying buds, the slow turn from green to brown, and how the year's rhythm is already traced from this morning in the field to that winter day under the eaves. A lift comes when your cousin trudges up with a basket of kitchen scraps for the compost heap at the field's edge. He stops to inspect your row, which means he stands over it until you hand him a handful of seed to scatter. He drops them with exaggerated care, as though each one were a coin he didn't trust the earth to keep. Midsection joke slips in when you tell him to make sure they're spaced evenly, so the reeve can count them without getting out of breath. The sun warms enough to bring the bees out fat, slow this early in the season. One lands on your sleeve, lingers as though unsure what's expected, then lumbers off toward the hedge. Above you, rooks circle and comment on the whole enterprise, their voices like iron on stone. You lean back on your heels and watch as the breeze ruffles the seedlings, already giving them the sway they'll need to survive summer storms. Wymond finishes his row and straightens with a groan, muttering about knees. He ties off his sack and heads toward the lane, pausing to tell you he's saving one corner of his plot for the good seed he got from the harbor trader. He winks as if the words themselves are worth something. You wonder if he's planted them or just enjoys having them in a pouch to show off at opportune moments. The cat curls up in a patch of sun near the compost heap, paws tucked, tail over nose. The old woman disappears back through the hedge, the faint smell of her cresset trailing like a bookmark in the air. You press the last few seeds into the row and pat the soil flat, your palm coming away damp and smelling of earth and green oil. Before leaving, you check the water channel at the field's edge. The thaw has filled it enough to feed the first weeks of growth, and you clear a small branch that's wedged itself against the flow. The water moves on, carrying twigs, leaves, and a feather that turns once before slipping under the shadow of the bridge. Not yours, you still feel the one in your pouch, but it catches your eye just the same. You shoulder your empty seed pouch and head toward the yard, where the day's other work waits. The sky is softened, clouds stretching thin to let in more light. You think about the months ahead, the stalks rising, the resin scent thickening, the loft filling again. End of section joke fits itself in as you pass the well. You tell yourself if the goose planted a field, it would charge rent to the seedlings. You leave the well behind, the joke about the goose still soft in your mouth, and the lane folds into evening like cloth pulled snug. Doors mutter shut. A dog turns twice and chooses sleep. From the mill, the wheel gives one courteous squeak and then resigns itself. Your hands remember the day in their joints, but the house opens to you, bar lifted, hearth a dull red under ash, and the small world inside accepts your weight without comment. You set the seed pouch on the board and ease the brazier into the circle of the hearth's glow. A coal accepts you, then another, each tucked with the little iron tongs until the bowl holds a quiet constellation. The reed slides from your sleeve as if it were meant to live in dusk. You wipe its stem with the corner of a cloth and feel the familiar patience in it, the way some tools learn your timing as you learn theirs. Early joke hums as you test a pinch if the reeve drops by now. You'll tell him the counting is finished for the day and the numbers will keep till morning, like bread under a cloth. You lay a sliver from the sailor's parcel in the tiny clay cresset the old woman lent you for a proper farewell to winter. Resin warms, loosens, and wakes with a note like pine finding honey. The room answers. Drafts quiet. The cat decides once again that your lap is a civic right and arrives with an air of due process. You concede. The miller's cake, what's left of it, yields 2 thin slices that pretend to be generous and succeed anyway. Through the shutters, you hear village sounds subtract themselves. A latch, a cough, a last bucket set down near the door to remind morning who is in charge. The ship-painted candle, your loyal little ocean tunnels deeper, the sail shadows double and fold as the flame shifts. You tuck the feather from your pouch under the candle's saucer to keep it level, a minor engineering marvel that would amuse the monk. The rope he took for the well will already be wet at the edges from the day's drawing. You can picture it. Clean twist, sure hands, a deep echo. A mainstream fact sits easily in this light hemp rope and cloth run across your century like seams. From river moorings and wellheads to sail rigs and sacking, the plant's fibers working where strength and patience must be cheap and constant. You think of the coil on your shoulder by the river, the trader's nod, the monk's palm on the braid as if blessing a practical psalm. Historians still argue whether village folk burned hemp for mood often, or whether those fragrant evenings were rare islands in a sea of work and weather. In your house, the sea and the island have reached an understanding. You tend the cresset once, just enough to keep the ember from sulking. The smoke that rises is not a crowd, only a few quiet opinions that the rafters consider and accept. You taste green, but darker than hedge or loft, older, almost bookish, like the priory's chamber when the lid lifts and the script breathes. Your shoulders settle by their own arithmetic. The room's edges round. Your cousin arrives without knocking, because knocking at this hour would be noise. He brings the news that the goose has returned to ordinary birdness and that the reeve counted it twice in goodwill and once in confusion. Midsection joke sets itself down. You answer that a thrice-counted goose should pay a penny toward the church lock. Your cousin says the goose will invoice instead. You hand him the reed and he draws gently, respectful as if greeting a host. Quiet stretches. The cresset's holes give their thin exhalations. You hear far bells from the priory, a sound that travels certain evenings as if the air already knows the path. The feather shifts under the candle saucer with the tiniest sigh, and you let that be your reminder to sip water, to keep the ember a friend. Quirky tidbit, learned from the alewife and proven by many spills before pouring. You wet the lip of a jug and smooth it with beeswax so ale runs true and not down the side. You do it now almost idly, out of habit, though the cup that follows is small and more for ceremony than thirst. The wax holds a trace of honey that rises when warm, and it shares a wordless kinship with the resin's sweetness, all of it folding into the same low register the night prefers. You check the banked hearth, pull a coal forward, and lay a brittle leaf from last season across it, just enough to lift the room to a kind story. It hisses, surrenders, and becomes part of the same patient cloud. You think of the herbalist's pressed sheets, tucked in your pouch beside the feather, neat as promises. You will keep them for a week of weather that bites again, for a guest with a restless head, for a day that forgets how to relax. The reed returns to you. You draw once, a careful, a steady line, and return the breath to the room, where it chooses the far corner by the settle to practice being a curtain. The cat needs 3 times, decides the world is acceptable, and still, the ship on the candle makes another harbor. Outside, someone sings half a line of something and then remembers that quiet has already begun. Erkishke, your cousin says, passing you the last thin edge of cake as if it were a vital document. For proofs, you take it with the seriousness required. The crumb is nutty, the seeds speak softly, and the faint green that follows is as much memory as taste. You close your eyes and see the loft again, bundles swaying, feathers falling, the sunlight stripe across the grinder's wheel. A small lift arrives in the form of a draft that noses the shutter and backs away, ashamed of itself. You tuck the bar tighter and feel the house approve. A thought strays to the monk's margin, to the ship he drew and sanded and drew again. Perhaps he is at his desk now, lids lowering, bowl waiting, quill drying. Perhaps the lay brother snips a rushlight to the next thumb's width. Perhaps names are anchors even in rooms where no one speaks them aloud. The cresset dims to an ember the size of a berry. You let it fade because endings teach the breath how to be slow. Your cousin stands, stretches until his vertebrae count themselves, and sets his cup in the place on the shelf where his hand goes without looking. He says he might dream of the riverboat's painted eyes. You say the eyes will dream of him instead and then charge a toll. End of section joke bows its head and takes its place. You see him out, raise the bar, and stand a moment in the lane. The village hum is a lower thing now, a sleeper's murmur. Frost films the well's rim. Far off, a fox remarks that it exists. You close the door, and the house receives you one last time today. You bank the hearth, ash over coal, like a promise to morning. The reed returns to your sleeve. The feather returns to your pouch. The candle's ship lowers its sail at last, and the wick throws a thin thread of smoke that snips itself and is gone. You lie down with your cloak pulled to your chin and let the room finish its sentence. Wind down, ease your breath, and let the house grow quieter than the cat, quieter than the shutter, quieter than the ember that has decided to be only heat now. Imagine the lane smoothing itself like a ribbon pulled flat, each stone turning cool and round under the night. Picture the mill wheel stilled at the stream's slow insistence, wood settled against water the way a hand settles against a table when the story is done. From the loft, let a memory of resin drift like a soft thread, not a cloud, not a claim, only a trace that says summer happened and will happen again. The reed sleeps where it always does. The feather keeps the page of whatever dream you will open to first. The cresset is a cool bowl set aside. The ship on the candle rests in its harbor, canvas folded, rope slack, no orders expected until morning thinks to issue them. Lay the rope's twist across your mind and feel it hold. One strand for work, one for rest, one for the thin line between them that evening knows how to walk. Hear the monk's pen lift and set, then lift and set, until even that neat rhythm fades. Hear the reeve forget to count, then remember, Then decide that remembering can wait. Let the goose become only a white shape on dark water. Then become water. Then become dark. You are in the bed that knows you. The blanket remembers your back. The rushlight shortens and does not ask to be replaced. The little house breathes through its beams. The village breathes through its lanes. The fields breathe through their new green. Each leaf a steady hand raised to the night in greeting rather than question. If a dream comes, let it be a bench in the yard, a warm cup, the low sound of someone you like saying nothing in particular. If it wanders, let it wander. The door is barred, and the bar is a line that even thoughts will respect if you ask them kindly. Everything you tended today will be where you left it tomorrow, just shifted by a thumb's width toward ripeness. The ember under ash knows how to wait. The water under ice knows how to talk. You know how to sleep and wake, to walk a lane, to tie a knot, to measure a pinch, to lift a latch without scaring the quiet away. Let the last of the light pool and then sink. Let the last of the sounds choose smaller rooms farther off. Let breath thicken, lengthen, soften its edges until it is a simple engine that asks nothing of you but time. Drift, and as leaves in a channel drift, past the bridge's shadow and into the easy, slow, dependable dark.